this year's Gender Talk series. I'd like to start by thanking the Black Cultural Center for their generous co-sponsorship of this event. I would also like to thank my administrative colleague, Kimberly Saderholm, and our talented student colleagues, Megan Markert, Mandy Snowden, and Michaela Allison, for their tireless efforts in coordinating today's event and for their programmatic efforts for it. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tiffany Willoughby-Herard. Dr. Willoughby-Herard is an associate professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Irvine, where she is also a core faculty member in the Culture and Theory PhD program and an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Political Science and Comparative Literature. Dr. Willoughby-Herard's research examines, among other things, the international dimensions of racialization, as well as how those racializations intersect with other experiences like sex and gender. Her research especially intervenes in philanthropic and educational organizations that have people reached. She's particularly concerned with the influence that scholars from South Africa and the United States have had on each other in the framing of their distinctive national debates about race and post-raciality. Dr. Willoughby-Herard's 2015 book, Waste of a White Skin, examines the racialization of poverty. In it, she analyzes the political and historical impact and effects of the Carnegie Commission study of poor whites in South Africa in the 1920s and 30s. Through attention to racial and class formations deployed by philanthropic organizations and social scientists in the United States and South Africa, Dr. Willoughby-Herard considers the politics of scientific racism and civilizing missions in particular with regard to the construction of the social identity of poor whites. In today's presentation, which draws from her current research on gender-based violence in South Africa, Dr. Willoughby-Herard will examine Pumula Gqola's singular 2016 study, Rape, a South African Nightmare, in conversation with Yvette Christianse's 2006 novel, Unconfessed. Dr. Willoughby-Herard's generative engagement with Gqola's text suggests that her decades-long history of struggle and resistance against gender-based violence in South Africa returns us to the complicated nexus of colonial imposition, religious dogma and its deployment as the cornerstone of enslavement, and silencing in the face of, quote, obligation to provide sexual labor, which for Gqola is a critical feature of rape. Following Gqola's insights, Dr. Willoughby-Herard will argue that rape and the conjoined contemporary crisis in South Africa are literally the practices of slavery and of slavery's racial sexual terror reenacted in the present moment. Today's respondent is Berea College's own visiting assistant professor of English, Dr. Gale Greenlee. Dr. Greenlee received her PhD from the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research examines the connections between Black and Latinx girlhoods, geographies, and social justice in children's picture books and middle grade and young adult novels. Her work is animated by a belief that these stories constitute a neglected archive of feminist thought that presents girls of color who resist inequity, imagine community, and actively move towards liberation and social change. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker and respondent.
Behind the microphone. It will be very hard because I have a very animated spirit. I want to thank Berea College and my colleagues, Dr. Greenlee, Dr. Malaklu, Dr. Lee, Dr. Carruthers, and also Dr. Saderholm for making space for me here and welcoming me and giving me an opportunity to be in your midst. I don't know if you all got a chance to say any kind of grace over your food, but I always consider the most important fellowship the chance to be with other people. So if you wouldn't mind taking a minute and just introducing yourself to one other person that you're sitting next to, or maybe to somebody that you don't know. Thank you all for taking time to do that with each other. You know, we live very, very busy lives with lots of obligations, and when we forget that we have the miracle of other people around us, we miss out on all the best stuff. I wanted to begin with an Indigenous lands acknowledgement, and I'm literally going to read parts of, along with some help from people in the audience, one that was crafted by Big Sandy members Tiffany of the Eastern Band Cherokee and Michaela Curry, with help from Madison County member Wendy Warren and staff member Nikita Paramal. So I will read the first paragraph, I think, and then I'll ask the other people in the room who I've asked to go ahead with it. Does that sound right? Okay. Indigenous peoples have always lived on the land that is now called Kentucky and continue to live here today. The place we now call Kentucky is primarily Shawnee, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Osage land. And I've invited other people to read as well. Sorry?
A commonly cited claim many of us had in history class growing up in that region was merely a honey ground. This claim is a myth, perpetuated at first by land speculations who wish to improve land sites, and still today as a way to absolve settler colonists and their descendants from grappling with their history of land theft, genocide, and white supremacy. The continuation of this myth is harmful for all of us. Indigenous peoples have lived on this land, now called Kentucky, for at least 12,000 years. Over thousands of years, various indigenous nations and cultures have called this place home, many with overlapping histories and territories. Those that avoided, survived forced relocation still have a large presence here, but not an effortless one. The Trail of Tears is only one place of very painful history for natives of the land that would become Kentucky. Assimilation and suppressive are common experiences that were necessary for survival. For many native people in Kentucky, this meant traditions kept quietly, languages passed on a few words at a time, hidden preservation of connections. They are still here in the 2010 census. There were recorded in 31,335 Native Americans being in Kentucky. And I apologize, I did not have my glasses.
Beautifully, you did beautifully. And this is literally how we do a thing. When you want to change a culture, we have to share the work of reading it to each other. Right? That's how our parents taught us how to read, reading to us. That's how they taught us to actually learn a new thing, telling us stories about it.
It's important to note that Native history and culture cannot be easily summarized, and it is our responsibility to learn carefully and respectfully. You can refer to the supplemental materials provided in your folder to learn more about the Shawnee and Cherokee. We also encourage you to research their practices, history, and way of life. When possible, it is best to refer mostly to the tribes themselves for their own historical accounts, as erasure in academia is a significant problem.
Native people are still here and are fighting for a wide variety of issues that are critically important to recognize.
There's a sentence that happened right above that one, and the sentence was, Berea College sits on Shawnee and Eastern Band Cherokee land. Can you repeat that sentence to yourself and then also to one other person? Can you tell that to one other person? Do you know the way that memory works? It works through cognition, but it also works and lands in the body. You may have an accident someday, and you may not remember anything, but your lips will remember that because you shared it with somebody else. So the last section, please.
In the United States, there is an epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women. Today, 4 out of 5 Native women are victims of violence, and that is only what gets reported. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, American Indian women face murder rates more than 10 times the national average. In the United States, in 2016, 5,712 murdered and missing Indigenous women were reported, but only 116 were logged in the Department of Justice Missing Persons Database.
Homicide is the third leading cause of death among Native girls and women ages 10 to 24. It is the fifth leading cause of death among Native women ages 25 to 34.
So sometimes we do land acknowledgements. They talk about First Nations people as if they only existed in the past and they don't have policy issues of concern right now, today. Things that you can actually enact and support and be in solidarity around. I love this land acknowledgement because of the way that it brings us right up today and things that we can actually be invested in. It's a wonderful tie-in to the work that I'm going to be talking about today in South Africa. Well, you will excuse me. It's very easy to find. It's from Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, and I urge you to use it whenever you are given an opportunity to speak publicly to other people, and perhaps even you might speak to university officials about creating one that's the university's official one, so that you have that. Thank you to everybody who participated. Let me go back to the slideshow now. In her singular study, Rape, a South African Nightmare, 2016, Pumula Gqola points to a decades-long history of struggle and resistance against gender-based violence in South Africa. This history returns us to the complicated nexus of colonial imposition, religious dogma, and its deployment as the cornerstone of enslavement and silencing in the face of, quote, the obligation to provide sexual labor, which for Gqola is a critical feature of rape. Rape and the contemporary crisis in South Africa is literally the practice of slavery reenacted in the present. In this paper, I use 2 literary works by contemporary political philosophers, Koleka Patuma and her collection of poetry called Collective Amnesia, and Yvette Christian's historical fiction novel Unconfessed, because they offer meditations on the histories that are necessary to recover and validate in order to understand the inextricable ties between sexualized racial colonialism, carcerality, and enslavement. I'm going to offer us a theoretical way for understanding the contemporary scourge of rape in South Africa. I argue that rape in South Africa is the cornerstone of both colonial and slave violence. In 2015-2016, nearly 52,000 women reported cases of rape, including so-called corrective rape, femicide, child rape, rape of men, and rape in the context of wider experiences of domestic violence. The ubiquitous and seemingly inscrutable accounts of violence that face South African people, particularly women, men, children, LGBTQ+ and trans feminine people, seem especially hard to understand in this post-apartheid period where allegedly democracy reigns supreme. And yet, one of the most virulent forms of state-supported racial colonialism and legalized racial segregation continues in the treatment of bodies. While the most basic account of these forms of sexualized gender-based violence argues that the violence in South Africa targets everyone equally, and simply has finally emerged in the light of day as one of the last relics of apartheid society, I'm trying to offer a different way of thinking about this epidemic of violence. Rape, in its various forms and all of its accompanying justifications in South Africa, has deep roots in the ways that European settlers organized racial colonialism and slavery together to occupy what has now come to be known as South Africa. Looking at the set of materials that we're going to be talking about today will help us ground ourselves in this. In Pumula Gqola's book, Rape, A South African Nightmare, the author explains, the rape of slaves was an integral part of slave-ordered Cape society. Note the place and naming of the slave lodge in Cape Town. Built in 1679, it served as housing for a total of approximately 9,000 slaves owned by the Dutch East India Company, prisoners and mentally ill people from 1679 to 1810. It was also known as the first brothel, and the company, slave women, prostitutes. As slave status passed through the maternal line, all of the children produced by these unions were enslaved from birth, regardless of paternity. Callan Garber, in 2019, in a reflection on Pumula Gqola's work, explained how under the imperialist ethics of sexual domination and subjection, such forms of sexual violence are, quote, not just admissible, but expected. Garber goes further, writing, the rape of slaves was an integral part of colonial South African Cape society. Sexual coercion and obligational sexual labor provided by slave women was commonplace. So before and alongside the institutionalization of the slave lodge, the very logic of slavery as a site of captivity set the stage for glorifying sexual violence as a singular achievement of European conquest, and a place depicted by history's winners as terra nullius, or legally uninhabited. So there were no people there and no crime occurring. This is the same context that labeled African women and men as the missing link between human and non-human, and which critic Ariana Bolton explains, quote, praised a European colonial imagination obsessed with rape, often depicting themselves as rapists in the land that they colonized as naked women. By the time that apartheid was introduced in South Africa, formally, legally, in 1948, there had been centuries of rape being the prevalent form of violence and control, end quote. Moreover, carcerality and captivity engendered the power of the slave lodge as the first physical architecture of European settlement and settler colonial presence there. This experience of captivity and carcerality gendered and raced African women as sexually available, sexually illicit, sexually perverse, and beyond sexual injury. What you see in this diagram is my attempt to kind of provisionally sketch out the way that I'm thinking about these very dense concepts. And at the center, you see gendered and raced polity-making projects. On the outskirts, you see forms of racial colonialism that emerge from it. So enslavement, colonialism, carcerality, apartheid, which is simply a form of Jim Crow racial segregationism that's always twinned with Jim Crow immigration exclusion, right? But at the heart of those, I'm suggesting that the polity, the political system, cannot be made without the kinds of sexual violence that are articulated by Gqola in her account of the slave lodge. Nowadays, if you go to South Africa or you fly on United like I did yesterday, the cover story will encourage you to go to Cape Town and see the slave lodge. It is literally the place that every tourist goes to. Imagine having the unenviable job of being the public historian who has to tell a story to tourists that enables that to be a place to go to as opposed to a place to memorialize or to weep or to grieve. And yet it is central to their economy. 2. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the many, many ways that gender-based violence manifests and how it is rejected. I'm going to focus on some stories that point to older legacies of sexual and other forms of gender-based violence, but some of which are not explicitly about rape and harms to the body. Why? Well, all of us kind of understand that the context that produces gender-based violence produces outcomes of vast intergenerational inequality. And the social forces that we name as gender, say gender, say gender, say gender. Gender is a social force. force. It gets enacted on people's bodies and psyches and through social processes, but it's not actually have nothing to do with your body and what social role you play, right? Gender is a social force. It's an energy, it's a dynamic, it's power. The thing that we often call gender is a social force and a dynamic. It has nothing to do with what's happening with your body. Your body becomes an alibi for that social force to do its violence and damage. So the social forces that we name as gender help us create policies about how certain bodies are treated and viewed and cared for, and how other bodies are discarded and marked for disposability and their use value. So while some of the news of the day from 2017 and 2018 when I was in South Africa on sabbatical includes stories explicitly about organized and individual responses to rape and sexual assault, the stories that don't foreground that type of violence draw on an important race and gendered lens to help us understand the material conditions that both produce and are the outcomes of normalized rape culture and normalized toxic masculinity. So this is the first headline story. And it says there, Lion Mama Walks Free. Journalist Wisile Bobu covered the story of an unnamed woman in rural Eastern Cape who killed one of her daughter's 3 attackers. Dubbed the Lion Mama, say Lion Mama. Lion Mama. Because somebody ought to say her name. She went to court surrounded by hundreds of gender justice activists, NGO workers in all sectors, as well as prominent anti-violence organizations with a local and international reach, such as Sonke Gender Justice and the influential director of public prosecutions that declined to prosecute her. The 56-year-old mother relayed that she was called back to her house and found 3 young men actively attacking her daughter. After she stabbed one of the attackers and made sure her daughter was out of harm's way, she left her home and asked members of the community to call the police so she could turn herself in, and call an ambulance for the 3 young men. So before we think I'm trying to endorse a carceral feminism, she brought the state in when she thought they were necessary, right? I'm not trying to endorse a carceral feminism. She knew that the state would be necessary, but she also knew that self-defense was necessary too. Held up as a model and a success, the Lion Mama received donations from all over the country to support her legal defense and to pay for her daughter to receive counseling. Invoking a logic of self-defense, the Lion Mama knew that there may be no legal ground or position for her stand, but she too enters the scene of violence. Headline number 2. If the Lion Mama gives us a sense of the celebrated desires of a large segment of South Africa's population, journalist James Malakwane's story about Sibongile and Dashe confirms the idea that South African leadership on the rights of LGBTQ plus people and people living with HIV and AIDS continues to stoke panic and distrust across the entire African continent because South Africa uses its advocacy for HIV positive people and LGBTQ plus positive people to do a kind of pink washing against the rest of the continent. Now, a South Africa that took 50 years to throw off colonialism and racial colonialism at that has this one thing that seems like it's really wonderful. It has a constitution, maybe one of the first constitutions, one of the first constitutions on the planet that guarantees legal legislative recognition for LGBTQ plus people. And yet it still has this kind of level of sexual violence. So the pink washing that it runs around the continent doing, sending people from place to place and saying, you better protect this population, doesn't square with the fact that within its own country, the legal protections it is guaranteed has not stopped all the other things that undercut the ability for queer, trans, gender, non-binary people to actually live and be free in the world. Headline number 3. Mary Rahube went to court to sue for the right to purchase a home that she had lived in for 4 decades after her own brother attempted to evict her. An illegal loophole taken advantage of by many during apartheid, and since its demise, her brother became the legal owner of the home where she had raised her children and grandchildren. Though South African courts, I'm watching my time, have invalidated the discriminatory apartheid laws that prohibited black women from owning land. If I can give a kind of useful parallel to the US, we all learn about the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first act was really targeting, our really earliest immigration act after the naturalization law was targeting Chinese women and labeling them as prostitutes. That happened almost an entire generation before the Chinese Exclusion Act. One of the ways that segregation operated in South Africa was prohibiting black women from being able to own property. So they might be the one working outside home and paying all the bills, but the only way that they could live in a city was if they gave the deed or paperwork over to their nearest male relative. So here it is after apartheid, this woman has given this deed to her brother and he tries to evict her. I know. Like, really? I'm gonna stop with the final example. No, there's two more. Then we have the story of Sibongile Promise Khumalo, who was a freedom fighter, who was a woman raped in the camps where military training was happening to fight against apartheid. So she was one of the young people who fled her country, moved away, and actually was raped by other freedom fighters. Her story just came out in 2018. She shows journalist Carl Collison the scar on her chest after she walked away from the Pan-Africanist Congress, one of the political parties, their military camp in Tripoli, trying to get to the African National Congress military camp in Cairo. She walked from Tripoli to Cairo, alone and on foot. She attempted to commit suicide when she got there, explaining, "I used a broken bottle. I wanted to get to my heart." I have to give you this kind of context, because if I don't give you context, you won't understand why I would turn to something like a novel or a set of poems. I want to share a 24-second clip of women being interviewed in news reporting about an action that happened in 2018 called the Total Shutdown in South Africa. The Total Shutdown was a march against gender-based violence and sexual violence, where tens of thousands of women in their local communities all over the country staged walkouts. They included on their placards handwritten lines from Koleka Batuma's poem. Lines that included things like, "Dear God, don't let me die with a gun to my head and my legs spread."
In a national total shutdown protest against gender-based violence, protesters started at the Cornerstone Stadium and ended at the Durban City Hall. Among those who participated are Zorila Khumalo's cousin. Zorila was brutally murdered by her partner in her room at the Mangosuthu University of Technology student residence, resident with ITU.
Each of these news stories gives us a sense of the complex range of issues that constitute gender-based violence in South Africa, and how we might begin to explain this range of conditions through some cultural studies and literary meditations on where this violence comes from and what these forms of violence are actually seeking to do. In Pumula and Christians, I find the philosophy of rebellion and refusal that crosses time and that invokes the immaterial and speaks to generations yet to come, to address the daily and everyday trauma of living in what Gale calls a fear factor. Their work also helps highlight and avoid caricatures about blackness as sexual avarice, blackness as unrapeability, blackness as sexual deviance, that has so often been marshaled to minimize black credibility around being targets of sexual violence, and have been so often marshaled to produce the white settler nation state. I'll give you another cross-spatial, cross-time parallel. At the end of 1994, when there was a spike in rape, femicide, corrective rape in South Africa, all of a sudden, the national accounts of this shifted from the work that had been going from the 1960s to 1980s on gender-based violence. The accounts that they were giving that rooted sexual and gender-based violence in colonialism to an account that, oh, black men are just wacky and sexually deviant. We've heard about that every single time there's a major political transition. It's literally how the polity, how the government reconstitutes itself, right? Through accounts of belonging, who belongs, who is a citizen, who can never be a citizen, who always does harm. So the same kinds of myths about the black male rapist that we saw after 1865 here are unsurprisingly circulating as an account in post-1994 South Africa. None of those myths make it possible for us to actually tell a true story about the centrality of sexual violence to the making of the nation state in South Africa. Are y'all still with me? Yes. 3, what it means to fight back with time-traveling ancestors on our tongues, Pumula and Christians. This history lands us squarely within the complicated nexus of colonial imposition, religious dogma, and its deployment as the cornerstones of enslavement and the silencing of women's voices in the face of the obligation to provide sexual labor. Rape as a contemporary crisis in South Africa, as I've mentioned before, you've heard it now 3 times, is literally the practice of slavery reenacted in the present, disrupting our temporality about the present, the past, and the future. The ideologies that propped up rape in the past and committed African women to the Cape Town slave life since the 1600s are functioning today to impose fear in everyone who reads in the world as female or feminine. Moreover, we might argue that slavery has a vibrant afterlife in South Africa. The evidence of this afterlife of slavery is that slavery's central organizing principle, the sexualized subjugation and entrapment of African women, and the sexualized selling and trafficking in children continues. Let me try to make this even clearer. The presence of the contemporary crisis of rape and other forms of gender-based violence point to the temporality-busting nature of slavery. One of the key mechanisms of governance is carceral control over African women's bodies. And it can show up in the project of racial colonialism, the project of racial slavery, and in the periods that claim to no longer have anything to do with racial colonialism and racial slavery. All right, so I want to go now quickly to Christians. Can I have 35 minutes? Can I steal a couple minutes from 35? Not 35 more minutes. I'm saying, can I go on until 35 instead of stopping at 30? Thank you. Yvette Christian's slave narrative reads the past as a codex for the present. Christian's tale relates the narrative of a free African woman, Scylla, who is trafficked from Mozambique, forced into enslavement in South Africa in the households of multiple small farm owners and small shop owners, and was then arrested and detained in town jail, and ultimately on Robben Island, another place on your tourist stop when you go to South Africa, just to go, for the crime of refusing to subject her child to enslavement. Scylla was promised freedom by countless owners, and each time she insisted on saying publicly that she was a free person who had been dragged into enslavement. She realized the law itself as a tool of constituting property distribution, with her body and the issue of her body as the singular property of the law. Scylla is unconfessed because she goes to court unwilling and refuses to retell the story of how she came to free her child from enslavement. She refuses to confess and to take the burden on her own shoulders for how it is that she happened to kill her child. It's very much like reading Beloved, with an account of carcerality and enslavement and captivity kind of layered together. Her child, at around the age of 5 to 8, she never tells us the actual age, sees his father prancing around the grounds of their land with his new horse at a garden party. And the father, this plantation owner, swoops up his white child to try to have that child ride on the horse. Scylla's child, the enslaved child, says, "Daddy, pick me up too." The public shame of this causes the father to try to almost kill the child in front of people immediately. Christian's narrator, Scylla, then takes her child with its broken limbs back to her hovel, and she ends that child's life and allows the child to become free from enslavement. the entirety of the novel, because you don't find out really until the last paragraph that she has killed this child, and you know this in the telling. You can tell this, right? Because of the trauma that's laden in the telling. What we know and what you can intuit and feel and absorb from the text is that there is only one type of agency for Scylla to protect that child. And that is complete, what Jordan Peele calls get out maneuver. There is no space of possibility. But throughout the novel, Scylla talks to her child. The real audience of the child, of the novel, is us as readers, and we are figured as Barrow. So as Scylla is talking to her child over and over again, it's an instruction about what kind of manhood one could possibly have in the context of racial enslavement and racial colonialism. And she says, if you ever dare, just talking to a dead child spirit, she says, if you ever dared to become the kind of man that's been forced upon me, I would kill you again, essentially. There's an enormous amount of legal and moral and ethical clarity about this. I'm going to switch to talking to you about Koleka Putuma, who I mentioned very briefly. Koleka Putuma is a young poet, and you can find her work all over the web, because people under the age of 25, under the age of 30 really know how to marshal social media and to really share a larger argument. But one of the things that I love about her work is she deeply cites it, situates it, roots it in an analysis of this long history of gender-based violence. And so the piece that I've shared with you from here is called Black Solidarity, and I want to read to you just the lines. It says, how come your revolution always wants to go rummaging through my underwear? That's one paragraph. The next, stop making our bodies a cemetery. I did not come here to die or to be a sacrifice for you, in her poem on Black Solidarity. It is not that she's saying that blackness and black consciousness is not something that we should hold on to politically. She wants to trouble the work that it can potentially do and make it accountable to her understanding of gender-based violence being central to the making of political organization. We can't get very far without actually analyzing that. I wanted to give Putuma the last word. This, I have discovered that my natural idiom is a 45-minute talk, but we don't have time for that, and that's okay. I'll make it work. I'm going to let Putuma have the final word. This is her performance of the poem Water, and it's 6 minutes long. It's very engaging, and then I will close and sit down and let Dr. Greenlee help us think this through.
So Tabitha mentioned that I was at TEDx Stellenbosch. And you know, I tried to leave my ratchetness at the door. I really tried. In academic spaces that just want to hijack your voice as a black person, I tried to keep it together. And so this was the last poem that I performed, and for 2 weeks after that, there was just hell in my inbox, but I don't care, whatever. Yeah, so this is my last poem that I leave with you. Thank you to the Word and Sound team for having me over. Thank you to all of you all for listening. The memory of going to the beach every New Year's Eve is one I share with cousins and most people raised black. How the elders would forbid us from going in too deep, to giggle, to splash in our black tights and ShopRite plastic bags wrapped around our leaves. Forbid us from riding the wave for fear that we would be a mass of blackness swept by the tide and never to return like litter. The elders forbid us as if the ocean has food poisoning. I often wonder why I feel as if I am drowning every time I look out into the sea. This and and feeling incredibly small. And I've often heard this joke about black people being scared of water or not being able to swim. We are mocked, and we have often mocked ourselves for wiping our faces the way that we do when we come out of water, compared to how they do it all Baywatch like that. How we so ratchet like our postures and kink. Every time our skin goes under, it's as if the reeds remember that they were once chains, and the water, restless, wishes that it could spew all the slaves and ships onto shore, whole as they boarded, sailed, and sunk. Their tears are what have turned the ocean salty. This is why our irises burn every time we go under. Every December 16th, December 24th, December 31st, our skin re-traumatizes the sea. They mock us for not being able to willingly throw ourselves into something that was instrumental in trying to execute our extinction. For you, the ocean is for surfboards, boats, tans, and all the cool stuff you do under there in your bathing suits and goggles. But we have come to be baptized here. We have come to stir the other world here. We have come to cleanse ourselves here. We have come to connect our living to the dead here. Our respect for water is what you have turned fear. The audacity to trade and murder us over water, then mock us for being scared of it. The audacity to arrive by water and invade us. If this land was really yours, then resurrect the bones of our colonizers and use them as a compass. Then quit using black bodies as tour guides or the site for your authentic African experience. Are we not tired of dancing for you, gyrating and singing on cue? Are we not tired of gathering as a mass of blackness to atone for just being here, to beg God to save us from a war we never started, to march for a cause caused by the intolerance for our existence, raise our hands so we don't get shot, raise our hands in church to pray for protection, and we still get shot there too with our hands raised. Invasion comes so naturally for your people, so you've come to rob us of our places of worship too. You've come to murder us in prisons too. That is not new either. Too many white people out here acting God, too many white people out here doing the work of God, and this God of theirs has my tummy in knots. Him and I have always had a complicated relationship. This blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus of my Sunday school has had my kind bow to a white and patriarchal heaven, bow to a Christ, his son and 12 disciples. For all we know, the disciples could have been queer. Some weird, twisted love triangle, and the Holy Ghost transgendered. But you choose to understand the scriptures that suit your agenda. You have taken the liberty to colonize the concept of God, give God a gender, a skin color, a name in a language we had to twist our mouths around. Blasphemy is wrapping slavery in the gospel and calling it freedom. Blasphemy is having to watch my kind use the same gospel to enslave each other. Since the days of Elijah, we have been engineered to kneel to whiteness, and we're not even sure if the days of Elijah even existed, because whoever wrote the Bible did not include us. I would rather exist in a godless holy book than in the history books that did not tell the truth about us, for us, on behalf of us. If you really had to write our stories, then you ought to have done it in our mother's tongues, the ones you cut off when you fed them a new language. We never consent, yet we are asked to dine with the oppressors and serve them forgiveness. How? When the only ingredients I have are grief and rage. Another one who looks like me died today. Another one who looks like me was murdered today by your kind. May that be the conversation at the table, and we can all thereafter wash this bitter meal with amnesia and go for a swim after that, just for fun.
African Women and Gender Non-Conforming Center for holding the space for everyone on campus, and also to the Dr. Willoughby-Herard for your talk, which I find variously provocative and also really disturbing. I used to apologize for emotion, but I don't anymore. I also see it as very necessary, your work, in urging us to listen to the wordsmiths among us, in this case, Yvette Christians, and Pumula, in whose work we may find hope. And Shani knows I'm struggling with a caution. She may be a cipher for my voice a little bit, but I continue. So where and how to enter? As a scholar of African American and multi-ethnic American lit, my work sits at the nexus between Black and Latinx urban studies, geography, literature, and pop culture. Concerned with reversing the invisibility of Black and brown girls, not just in literary spaces, but in social, cultural, and political ones as well. I sit with stories that comment on the structural mechanisms and spatial conditions that render Black and brown girls as non-subjects and non-citizens. Like Dr. Willoughby-Herard, I'm interested in how we create spaces of possibility for Black people, especially those of us who walk in the world as Black women and girls, whether cis, trans, or queer. I look at here and how and where and when we enter. From her opening comments about the slave lodge and the brothel, I cannot help but consider her work in relation to conceptualizations of place and space advanced by geographers, Black geographers, and spatial theorists. Catherine McKittrick's demonic grounds aptly distinguish between traditional concepts of geography, which we can understand largely as white and patriarchal, Eurocentric, heterosexual, class, and imperialist, from those of Black women's geographies, which are defined by a legacy of exploitation, exploration, and conquest. In short, legacies of violence that define and circumscribe our existence. In her paper and her talk, Willoughby-Herard moves nimbly from pop culture in the Claus TV show to the U.S. Academy, to the South African political and social landscape, and to literature. She charts the ways that white masculinized solidarity meets violence upon Black women and girls in queer communities, and how it is dependent upon these enactments of violence in order to construct or lay the track for the nation. Expanding conceptions of what constitutes damage and what figures as harm, she offers stories of racialized gender-based violence, and in doing so, she creates a loose but long genealogy that speaks to an excess of power exercised over Black women's bodies, lives, and futures. The depth of the Greek catalog of harm is the source of my disturbance. She shows us multiple iterations of violence ranging from the imprisonment of South African human rights workers, the virtual erasure of queer communities by polities, the exclusion of people living with HIV and AIDS in Tanzania, legal acts that created racial and gender, spatial, and economic inequalities by prohibiting Black women's rights to own property, and of course the female freedom fighters who were raped in anti-apartheid military training camps. This catalog maps forces that converge to frame and reinforce Black women's powerlessness and vulnerability to violence, while bolstering white male power and the power of the state, same thing. And they exist with social and political spaces layered and defined by histories of colonization, global capitalism, racism, and patriarchal rule. I am moved then, despite the thickness of these spaces, by the story of the Lion Mama who entered the scene of violence in order to protect her child. How do women enter a space where we already reside? How do Black women, if always already existing in spaces of historic and perpetual violence, disrupt or halt assaults against us in order to alter that same space and improve the conditions and possibilities for us? How do we imagine or create a world new? This, I would say, is one of the gifts and purposes of story. McKittrick asserts that, quote, the poetics of landscape allow Black women to critique the boundaries of transatlantic slavery, rewrite national narratives, and offer several reconceptions of space and place or more humanely workable geographies. This is what I see in Chris Johnson's fiction and Pumbala's poetry, creating alternatives to the long-established geospatial arrangements that center Black women as non-being and non-entities. Literature is the vehicle that allows them, and also us, to speak the unspeakable, a la Toni Morrison, functioning as a record of violence. Stories serve as wombs that give life to different epistemologies, new visions of well-being, of community, and yes, of even action. She is apt in her comparison of Selah's story to that of Setha in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Selah, like Setha, takes her child's life in order to save him from a life of violence and enslavement. Her act, though seemingly crazy or maniacal to some, indicts the past and presence, not present, but presence, of white settler colonialism for producing the very need for her rebellion. Her refusal to confess, her decision to remain silent but not silence, denies any individual culpability and lays her son's death squarely in the bowels of a legal and social system dependent on denying her humanity, her beingness, and that of her black child. Selah's refusal to confess locates the violence not in her own hands, but in the cultural and societal forces intent on utilizing black women's bodies as fuel and trash, as commodities and expendable non-matter. Selah's refusal reconfigures and challenges notions of space, and it demonstrates, as McKittrick notes, that, quote, black female subjects can assert political aims through redefining and refusing to fully accept traditional geographic limitations. Selah's act aims towards abolition, her son's freedom, through death, crossing space and time. His presence, though absent, is still there, still here, separated only in a bodily realm, not a spiritual one. And through her otherworldly conversations with her son, her talks challenge positivist notions of here and there, of then and now. Selah communes, she weaves and works to shape a different vision of masculinity and of the world, one not rooted in ravaging women's bodies and being. Though focused on South African women's writings, the connections to this side of the Atlanta is clear to me. Legacies of sexual violence extend throughout the diaspora. And here in the U.S., black women have long taken up the pen to theorize and imagine freedom and create pathways for their own, our own, and our project's future. Harriet Jacobs' physical confinement in the garret allowed her to mother her kids and protect them in secret, and to craft her own freedom map, ultimately freeing herself and her children. Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower centers Laura Obamina, a black girl whose hyper-empathy, a condition stemming from legacies of racial and gender-based violence run amok, enables her to vision and fashion a more just and humane world. What Christiane's story and Puma's poem Water help us realize is that no matter the violence perpetrated against black women, those legacies and the very bones we pick up from the water can serve as seeds of a new life in the hands of an able scribe. Like that of black feminist doula and reproductive justice activist Adrienne Marie Brown, Christiane's story and Puma's poetry provides critiques of power and inequity, as well as models that recognize women, black women, girls, queer, and trans communities as political agents. Turning to what she calls Christiane's slave woman's wisdom novel, Willoughby-Herard shows us the utility of the creative as a source of political expression and visions of unimagined routes of liberatory action. Their work is holy, it is beautiful, it is political, it is necessary. Let us bathe in these waters and listen.
Do y'all remember that scene in Beloved where, I'm gonna remember, I'm not gonna remember the character's name. Baby Slug's Holy says, love your hands. And it's like a moment to remember the people that she's ministering to, how important the body is. Can you look at your hands? May you love your hands. May you love the flesh that you are in. And may it never be used to harm you. to convey the violence of gender. There was a talk that Shay Sullivan gave on our campus at Irvine. Shay Sullivan is a survivor of the UCLA Gender Clinic that went on from 1963 to 1994. And it was a research clinic where children, without any consent given by children or parents, were identified and studied for most of their childhood to try to prevent them from becoming quote-unquote sissy boys or masculine girls when they grew up. And Shay said during the talk, what I love to do in my classes is always ask people, what is your gender? Do you like it? Who gave it to you? Is it still useful to you? Do you need to get rid of it? And I thought it was such a revelatory moment to try to step in between. You know how in Buddhism they say take a pause, right? Or any kind of work you're doing, if you're working at NA or NA, like take a pause and surrender, right? To some other entity to enable you to reconnect your body to your consciousness or to your higher power or something. Surrender, stop for a moment. I love Shay's question because it reminds me that this is something that was given to me and that there's a whole journey of work, a lifetime of journey of work to figure out why it was given to me and what kind of power or borrowed institutionality was imposed on me through that gift of that thing. What is it supposed to mean? How am I supposed to organize myself in the world? And what I really mean when I say that, in addition to that insight I just learned from Shay a couple of weeks ago, is how important it is to not just think when we're saying gender and sexuality studies that we're talking about the objectified bodies of women or the objectified bodies of trans people, the fetishized bodies of LGBTQ plus people. That we're actually talking about a system of power, a relationality of power that operates on everybody. That doesn't mean I want to silence the bodies of those people who have come up with these wonderful knowledge forms and epistemologies to challenge power, to challenge violence, to challenge subjectivity, to challenge domination and subjection. But it's not just about those identity categories. Because what happens is that power is so good about stealing from us that, like, probably in 2024, we'll get a president that can tell us some neoliberal, race-whispering, trans-whispering story, and we'll think we've achieved something. And we haven't actually transformed the system of violence. And I know that not just because after 1994, South Africa couldn't transform its society in deeply profound ways that people needed it to be transformed. But because in 1865, we couldn't do it here. And in 1888, they couldn't do it in Brazil. And because in the 1900s in Cuba, to handle the black people, particularly black men, who stood up and said, we will have a nation here, they massacred 6,000 people who weren't even part of the abolitionist movement there. So it's a human concern about the nature of being, to understand gender in that way.
Thank you, everyone. Just a quick note that our next Gender Talk event will be January 15th with Che Gossett. I hope you can all make it.
Children's reading on the subject matter. Children's books. Children's books on reading on the subject.
I have to think a little. I should be able to like put right to my fingers right now, but my kids are into chapter books now, and so we're not reading the younger books. But if you email Dr. Malaklu, I will give you a list. But I think maybe Sis here, Dr. Greenlee might be the better person. What's your name?
Wilson Joel.
Wilson Joel. Nice to meet you.
Sure. How are you?